This is a knight, a trained, armoured soldier, begging for his life before a snail. This is a rabbit executing a prisoner. And this is meant to be the infant Christ, who appears to be a 40-year-old accountant who has been shrunk in the wash. Our medieval ancestors, dear reader, drew the strangest pictures in the whole of human history. And the truly wonderful part, the part I intend to spend the next several minutes upon, is that there are reasons for every last bit of it. Mad reasons, but reasons. Dear reader, I must confess to you how I came to be looking at these images at all, for it is not entirely to my credit. I had a disagreement with my mother. The subject, as ever, was my marriage, or rather my stubborn refusal to acquire one. Words were exchanged. I shall not repeat them, except to say that I suggested she might marry the next eligible gentleman herself, since she is so very fond of them, and she suggested I was determined to die alone and unloved in a cold rented room. So I did what any reasonable young woman does when her mother has become unendurable. I put on my hat and I fled. And I fled, dear reader, to my favourite refuge in all of London, a great, vast, echoing old museum, where one may wander for hours among the dead and the ancient, and be troubled by absolutely no one. No mothers, no suitors, no mustachioed gentlemen counting imaginary children. Only quiet and history, and the company of objects far too old to have opinions about my marital status. It was there, in a dim gallery in the farthest corner, that I came upon a collection of medieval art. And reader, I forgot my mother entirely, because I have never in my life seen anything so peculiar, so unhinged, so gloriously, confidently wrong. So allow me to share my findings, and to answer the question that seized me on the spot. What on earth was the matter with medieval artists? To understand the weirdness, dear reader, we must begin with books. Because in the medieval world, a book was an extraordinary thing. There was no printing as we know it. Every single book was written out entirely by hand, a slow and painstaking labour, often passing through many pairs of hands. A book was not a thing one popped out to buy. It was a treasure, fabulously expensive, and most were commissioned by the only two parties who could afford them, the church and the very rich. The grandest of these were the illuminated manuscripts, handwritten books decorated so lavishly that the pages seemed to glow. Gold and silver were worked into the letters and pictures, giving off a shimmer, a literal illumination, which is precisely where the name comes from. Beautiful, painstaking, devotional work. And then, around the edges of all this solemn beauty, in the margins of the page, medieval artists lost their entire minds. The decoration in the margins has a name, Marginalia, and it became wildly popular from around the 13th century onward. Sometimes the Marginalia politely illustrated the text, a medical book with medical drawings, that sort of sensible thing. But very often, dear reader, the margins did something far more interesting. They argued with the text. They mocked it. They wandered off into pure, unsupervised whimsy. There was even a particular fashion for comic marginal drawings, little scenes built on the idea of the world turned upside down, where the natural order was merrily reversed and everything was delightfully wrong. And because these precious manuscripts were passed down and added to over many years, later hands would sometimes add their own drawings to the margins, so that a single book becomes a record of generations of people, each quietly contributing their own strange little doodle to the family madness. Which brings us, inevitably, to the snails. In the late 13th century, for reasons that no living historian can fully explain, the artists decorating these manuscripts became collectively, simultaneously, obsessed with a single image: a knight in mortal combat with a snail. And not as a single joke by a single bored monk. This image appears again and again across dozens of examples in many different books over a span of decades. Sometimes the brave knight charges the snail. Sometimes, and this is my favourite, the knight is on his knees, begging the snail for mercy. Occasionally, the snail is armed. Occasionally, the snail is winning. What does it mean? Nobody is entirely certain, which I find marvellous. Some scholars suggest the snail mocked the nobility, hiding in their shells as the rich hid in their grand houses. Others read it as a joke about cowardice, a gallant knight reduced to terror by a garden pest, the whole ideal of knighthood gently deflated. One respected historian proposed it was political mockery aimed at a particular group of people with a reputation, in that time and place, for being cowardly and disagreeable. We may never know. And honestly, dear reader, I hope we never do. There is something perfect about an entire generation of artists agreeing, without explanation, that the funniest possible thing to draw was a soldier losing a duel to a mollusk. If the snails were not enough, allow me to introduce the rabbits. Now, the rabbit, dear reader, carried gentle meanings. From the ancient world, it was a symbol of fertility, for obvious and rather indelicate reasons I shall not dwell upon. And in Christian thought, it came to stand for purity and innocence and salvation, which makes it all the more delightful that medieval artists drew rabbits doing this. Rabbits running men through with swords, rabbits jousting, rabbits executing prisoners, rabbits riding into battle upon hounds. A soft, harmless little symbol of purity, transformed into a pitiless warrior, butchering terrified men who beg for their lives. How? Why? The likeliest answer is the same upside-down logic as the snails. A very old tradition, going right back to the early church, used the rabbit as an emblem of cowardice, comparing a fearful man to a trembling hare. And since so much of this marginal art delighted in reversing the natural order, a rabbit, hunting and slaughtering men, becomes the perfect joke. The ultimate coward turned conqueror, the prey become the predator. The world, once again, gleefully turned upon its head. Now we come to religious art, dear reader, and to a mystery that has troubled every modern person who has ever wandered through a medieval gallery. Why does the baby Jesus look like that? You know the look I mean. The infant Christ, depicted not as a baby at all, but as a small, fully grown man, balding, careworn, with the face of a tired tax inspector who has been somehow miniaturized and handed to a confused-looking Virgin Mary. It is, frankly, unsettling, and it was everywhere. But, and this is the wonderful part, it was not because medieval artists had never seen a baby. It was deliberate. It stems from an idea the Church embraced, that Christ, being divine, was perfect and complete from the very beginning. He did not need to grow into wisdom like an ordinary squalling infant. He arrived already whole, already grown in spirit. And so artists painted him as a tiny grown man, his unbabylike appearance a way of saying, this is no ordinary child. This is the divine, fully formed from the first moment. It was symbolism, dear reader, not incompetence. The strange little man-baby was making a theological argument, and the fashion faded only later, around the Renaissance, when artists turned their attention from symbol to realism, and began, at last, to paint babies that looked like babies. A great improvement for art. A great loss, I think, for comedy. 2 last wonders before I am thrown out of this museum at closing time. The first is the medieval obsession with death. You will find throughout this art a great deal of skeletons, of death himself looming over the unsuspecting, of grim reminders that life is short and the grave awaits us all. This had a name and a purpose. Art meant to remind the viewer that death is certain, and that one had therefore best live well in order to die well. And it grew especially fervent, as you might imagine, in the years after the Black Death swept through, and carried off something like 1/3 of all the people in Europe. When death is that close, that constant, and that vast, a society rather understandably becomes preoccupied with it. The grim art was not morbid for its own sake. It was people trying to make sense of an unimaginable amount of loss. And then, because medieval art will never let you stay solemn for long, there are the animals. Oh, the animals, dear reader. Some are perfectly good. A horse looks like a horse, more or less. But others suggest the artist had the creature described to them once, by a stranger, in the dark, through a closed door. There are elephants with trumpets for noses. There are dogs that appear to be screaming. There is a crocodile that I can only describe as a disappointed sausage with legs. And the hippopotamus, the poor hippopotamus, defeated medieval artists so completely and so consistently that no 2 of them agree on what it might have been. Now, in fairness, some of these creatures the artists had genuinely never seen. It is hard to draw an octopus from a traveller's vague description, but that excuse does not stretch to cover the dogs and cats they saw every single day. The truth is simpler and rather lovely. Medieval artists, by and large, were not trying to copy nature. They were not aiming for realism at all. They valued symbol and meaning and style far above mere accuracy. A lion was not meant to look like a lion. It was meant to mean courage, or Christ, or kingship. The picture was a kind of language. And that, dear reader, is the secret I carried home from the museum. We look at these strange snails and warrior rabbits and elderly infants and disappointed sausage crocodiles, and we laugh, and assume our ancestors were simply bad at drawing. But they were not. They were speaking a language of symbol and faith and humour and meaning that we have simply forgotten how to read. To them, every odd little image meant something. We have lost the meaning and kept only the strangeness. which is why their sacred art is now chiefly used to make us laugh, a fate I suspect those devout monks could never have imagined, and would not entirely have deserved.
I stayed until the attendants turned me out at closing, and as I stepped back into the street, back toward home and mother and the whole tiresome business of being an unmarried woman of 21, I felt, for the first time in a fortnight, entirely at peace. There is a great comfort, dear reader, in remembering that people have always been this strange. We are not the first ridiculous generation. We are merely the latest. Until next time, I remain yours, restored, unrepentant, and newly devoted to a knight who lost a duel to a snail. Yours, History.